So I think what I didn't realize when I first started a company was that team morale was so important. That as the CEO and you are kind of making these decisions, and then everybody else who is coming along for the ride with you, they feel this huge whiplash.
Peter Saddington, your big game hunter. And guys, we have our sights on someone special today. Only a mother could invest in this idea.
Made this like super artistic.
That is actually absolutely correct. And that's a very, very astute assessment, actually.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of VC Hunting with me, your host, Peter Saddington. I am super excited today, guys, to introduce an awesome human being, an awesome person, and someone who is different from many of the other interviews that we've already had. She's a woman. She is an ex-partner of 500 Startups, an ex-Googler, and currently the GP, general partner, and co-founder of Hustle Fund. Elizabeth YIN, thanks so much for being on the show.
Well, thanks, Peter. Thanks for having me.
I want to jump right into it. This is really exciting for me to think about and talk about. But I first want to give some context to our viewers and everyone out there. How did you get into venture capital? And if I can set up the question, what was the circumstance? What was the situation that moved your hand or had you to have to move your hand to move into venture capital? Or was it an intellectual, cognitive decision that happened over time? Tell us, what was the circumstance that led to you making the decision to jump into VC full time?
So first off, I actually never ever thought about going into VC as a career. I think, so many of my peers aspire to do so, but that was just never on my radar or my interest. I'd say that for me, actually, I kind of fell into it accidentally, and we can talk about that. But
yes, please do.
I'm actually from the Silicon Valley where I'm sitting right now, and I grew up during the dot-com boom. So I always knew that I wanted to be an entrepreneur, actually. Like that's what I wanted to do in the late 90s, as you can imagine. So I studied engineering in college. I worked at all these big tech companies, including Google. And I did start my own business and grew that for many years before selling it in 2014. So entrepreneurship is my thing. And in 2014, I was trying to figure out what to do. I actually it's funny enough, like on one hand, I was super excited for LaunchBit to be acquired. But on the other hand, I felt this deep void, like, what am I going to do now? And so basically I had done a fair bit of soul searching from, I'd call it the end of 2014 for the next, call it year or two.
Right.
And during that time, one thing led to the next. Like I was trying to figure out what is a new business that I want to start. And I was working at 500 Startups at that time, trying to figure out what to do. And I thought that would be a good place to actually get exposure to many different things that other people were working on. When I realized that actually the business that I wanted to start and the problem that I wanted to solve was that actually I think that venture capital is broken. And that's what we're trying to do with Hustle Fund. So I very much see this from an entrepreneur's lens.
Wow. I mean, so much to get into there. I will leave it to the internet sleuths to figure out a little bit more of the context of what soul searching you did, but there's might be some questions in there. But you ended up at 500 Startups, and that gave you exposure, it gave you opportunity to see what the venture capital world was like. And obviously you had your own experience of it, but going into 500 Startups really gave you kind of an inside look. And from what you garnered from that is that venture capital, your words, is broken. Talk to me. What does that mean? Because that is deep as it is wide, Elizabeth.
I think for many of us as entrepreneurs, and you may relate to this as well, Peter, is, you only have one data point, your own experience of building your business and your interactions with VC. And so when I was pitching my ad company to various VCs and, I would get various reactions, I always internalize that as, well, maybe that's just how they think of me. I never really extrapolated as, oh, they're treating me like this because I'm a woman or because of whatever. I just, very logically thought this is just one data point. But then when I was at 500 Startups, and at first I was mentoring companies there, but then eventually ended up joining the team there and running the accelerator, then I could see a lot of data points, right? I had nearly 200 companies go through my batches. And we were obviously analyzing many more companies. So I got to see the other side of the fence and all these companies and what they were going through. And it occurred to me that actually some of the things that I had noticed or felt in my own personal experience could be more generally extrapolated. And basically, I would say, if I were to make that very concise, it's the best executors don't always get funded. In fact, actually, it's very rare that they do. The people who get funded tend to fit a certain pattern. And this notion of pattern matching really is true. If you fit a certain profile, like a certain demographic, whether it's race or gender or where you went to school or where you worked, or even if you're extroverted, you certainly have advantages over introverts. If you fit particular patterns, you have incredible advantages in fundraising. Flip side is we've got a number of portfolio founders who are even, let's just say introverted, like we can leave race and gender out of the equation for now, like introverted, that does not work for people. It doesn't help you raise money. And
Right.
I felt like that was a huge problem. And so for Hustle Fund, we really are trying to fund the best executors regardless. I mean, some of them certainly do have pedigree, many do not. Some of them do fit these stereotypical profiles, many do not. But we just want to fund the best executors, and that's our thesis and what we're going after.
Wow, there's so much to dig in there, but I want to unpack this a little bit, Elizabeth, your idea around those who fit this pedigree, this mold, this pattern that generally get funded versus the ones who you and I know, especially as entrepreneurs, we know it's the ones who execute are the ones that have the highest chance of success. But often we lack, in many cases, we lack the pedigree or we lack the mold. And I think what you're saying here is you got to see that within the 500 startups world and going through all these deals and seeing those patterns. And Hustle Fund, I don't want to put words in your mouth, you correct me if I'm wrong, but Hustle Fund was really your response, not reaction, because reaction is emotional. You really had an opportunity to let this bake, I'm assuming. And then Hustle Fund really is a response to what maybe the unfairness that you saw that was pretty rampant in the venture capital world. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Mm-hmm.
And so I want to ask you a tough question, an honest question here. I actually had written this down earlier. I said, give me the honest truth. Like, what is it like, Elizabeth? What is it like to be a woman in tech, but not merely tech? What is it like to be a woman in VC, in venture capital? And how would you change it? How would you change it? Obviously, you can talk about Hustle Fund and how you guys are doing that, but how has your experience been in tech and venture capital? And what would you change about it if you could?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think my purview as a woman in VC is actually very different compared to, let's say, a woman who's working at an existing firm. Mm. So I see this very much again as, we are starting a business. It happens to be a VC business, but, as a founder and, one of the managing partners, I have a lot of say and control over the culture and what we aim to do. And frankly speaking, there is nobody who can, I guess, directly fire me or challenge me. I think in terms of the power dynamic, yes, certainly I think my business partners, if they're upset with me, they can get rid of me. But I think the point is it's very different from going to work for somebody else at a VC. So I think that's the first caveat I would say. But the second thing is I think more generally in the industry, certainly I do notice things. Like, for example, there are activities and they're actually meant to be legitimately good bonding activities of sorts that are available for networking purposes or whatever. But, often some of these activities are challenging, I think, for certain people. I think
they could be tailored to a certain demographic. Is that fair?
It could be, right? Like, I'm probably not going to be hot tubbing with all of my VC colleagues. It's not to say that I wouldn't, but it's probably not the first thing that comes to mind, like when I want to build rapport. So just as an example, and there's nothing wrong with hot tubbing, obviously, it's great. But I think, in terms of separating your personal from your professional life, I think that is, a challenge. I think other things involve around like evening activities.
Right. It can be frustrating and a little bit off-putting if you go to a conference, let's say, because you and I have been to many, and part of the evening activities are generally tailored to a specific demographic. Let's just say they've sectioned off a full 2 hours for hot tubbing for everyone. It's like, not really into the hot tubbing, guys.
many people don't want to see their colleagues or, you know, their potential business partners in a swimsuit, let's just say.
I look better dressed. I look better dressed.
So I think, you know, that's obviously a very small example, but it's these little things where they build up, and certain people may feel welcome or unwelcome, even just based on sort of the structure of events or the structure of how people interact and that sort of thing.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a great perspective. And I really appreciated your caveat there that there really is a differential between being a woman owner versus a woman employee. Obviously, being a woman employee, you are beholden to certain cultural nuances that you implicitly or explicitly agreed to when you joined that company and that culture. And so there's definitely a different decision matrix that you guys operate from, and some you got to say yes to, and some you don't. So certainly you have the privilege of being able to say, you know, we're in control of the ship. We're in control of our destiny at Hustle Fund. We model the culture and the behavior that we think is appropriate, and frankly helps us and puts us in a position of success. You know, speaking of Hustle Fund, I want to go back to, because this is the VC hunting show. So we do a little bit of hunting. I want to go back to a blog post that you wrote in September 11th, 2018, your Hello World blog post on the hustlefund.vc website. There's an interesting thing that you wrote about. You said you didn't think very deeply about the type of people you wanted to raise from and what they might be able to provide outside money. And one of the things that you talk about on your Hustle Fund website is that you have a big vision to change how startup investing happens. Tell us more. What are you doing differently at Hustle Fund, and what has changed about your countenance and about your character that allows you to look deeper into the people that you're getting money from, and deeper into the entrepreneurs that you fund and you finance?
Yeah, I think we're changing things in two ways, at least at this point. So the first is just in terms of general courtesy. So I think that's the first thing I noticed that was broken in VC. And maybe some of you have experienced this, you, Peter, may have experienced this. Certainly I did. When you pitch a lot of VCs, you know, when I was trying to raise money for LaunchBit, just even simple things like VCs are always late, or they cancel their meetings and change them on you, or they ghost. They just don't respond. You've been talking with them for weeks and then they just go MIA, things like that. Professional courtesy is pretty lacking in the overall industry. Not everybody, but certainly for a lot of investors. And now that I'm on the other side of the fence, I get it. VCs are busy. They get swamped with a lot of emails. They get swamped with a lot of people. But I think people could do a better job of organizing their schedules and just being on top of things through processes like any other industry. So that's the first thing.
If I may interject, I think that really matters, though. I mean, at the end of the day, we can talk tech, we can talk numbers, we can talk evaluations, we can talk term, right? We can talk all of that stuff. But at the end of the day, isn't it just flesh and blood that we're dealing with here, right? Real people.
Yeah, sure.
End, right. And so I think
you're working with people. Yep.
Absolutely.
And you want to build great rapport, like both ways, right? You want from your investors, you want your investors to treat you with respect. You want them to show up more or less on time. You want them to stay true to their commitments. That you know, there's sort of a general code of courtesy that exists or should exist in every industry. But for whatever reason, it doesn't really exist in VC. And it sounds funny to say that out loud because it feels like such a low bar, but you've got to start with the low bars. So that's the first thing. And I think that, you know, frankly speaking, we hope that we do that better. Obviously, we're not perfect. I'm sometimes late. But, you know, we try to do that better. And we're hoping that by doing that better, that will help raise the bar overall, because that will force all VCs to also try to do something similar. And I know many other microfunds have much better general courtesy. And I do think that bar is being raised. It will force, just in order to compete, it will force VCs to, you know, stay on time.
I have a question. Do you think that the common courtesy, and I'm gonna agree with you 100% here. In my experiences of venture capital and out west your way, New York, which sometimes they're even worse in terms of their cultural nuances and how they handle themselves personally too, which bleeds into maybe the cold-heartedness of VC sometimes, to the lackadaisical that we have down here in Atlanta in the South. So I can completely agree that there is a culture of common courtesy in venture capital that is a little bit lacking. Here's the question. Is it because that they have all the power, or at least, you know, they're the ones funding, so they have the power, you understand? Or is it just because they're like any other company, that as they grow larger and larger, they become more insular and more to the whims of the needy inside than those outside? What do you think it is? Is it a combination of both?
I think it's lack of competition.
Ooh.
So actually power is related to that. You have less power if there's a lot more competition, right? If
I
the
like that
consumers
answer.
have choice, there's less that you can take it. You can't take advantage of consumers when they have a lot of choice. So that's basically what's happening. So what I do notice, and actually it's interesting you mentioned different geographies, I actually think that because there's been a rise of so many VCs, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area, you see much better behavior now than you did 5 years ago even. But I don't think that's quite carried over into other markets. Like you mentioned, Atlanta, for example, there are not that many investors. So in a market where there are not that many investors, let's just say hypothetically there's only one investor, that one investor can pretty much do whatever he or she wants because people will still go to him or her. But if all of a sudden Atlanta had like a whole influx of hundreds of seed investors, I'll bet you things would change pretty quickly.
I would agree. I bet your hypothesis would be 100% true, because there's a couple big ones here, but you know, I don't need to speak it to truth. You know what's going on down here in Atlanta and the venture capital culture down here. It's a lot of family offices, and that type of culture bleeds into the low risk. Everything must have a maximum amount of traction. And by the way, we hold all the power because we have generational wealth, and you don't. So.
And I think, you know, part of this is we are going into other markets. In fact, most of our investments are outside of the Bay Area. So while we certainly do look at companies in the Bay Area, we are trying to give investors, a run for their money, some competition in certainly every market in the U.S. And, you know, this is going to be a work in progress for sure. I don't think that our small fund is making quite a dent in that yet, but that is an ethos that we are trying to propagate across all VCs. So that way, you know, it's not just about us and our business, but can we actually change the industry? So that's number one. And then the second thing also is in the way that we actually execute our hypothesis. So I think earlier I said, well, it's interesting, my observation of 500 startups, just from watching all these companies come into my accelerator, is that I learned so much more when the companies came in and I saw them work. I learned so much more than hearing them pitch. And it occurred to me that actually hearing people pitch is kind of a not very informative exercise. Like, I don't really understand how this whole industry started where people would just listen to pitches all day and then decide to invest. That's actually not a very good way to invest.
I love it.
A much better way to invest is actually by watching people work. Now, that just sounds obvious when you say it out loud. Like, if I gave you a choice, you know, you have to deploy $100,000 into a whole series of startups. In one scenario, you're going to listen to them pitch for an hour, each of them. In another scenario, you get to watch each of them work for 20 minutes across 3 different time periods. Which would you prefer? And I think most of us would pick the second because it's more informative. You get to see progress along the way, but it's not just the actual traction. It's also, you get to understand how people think about things, how they make decisions. You get to understand how they interact with you. And I think the flip side is it's actually good for the entrepreneur. They get to see how the investor interacts with them as well. Like, do I even like this person? So for us, addressing the second component to changing the way that VC works is, I actually think that a much better way to invest from a returns perspective, never mind even a cultural perspective, but a returns perspective, is by watching execution and really being, you know, having a seat at the table on execution. So what we do is we actually invest fairly liberally in many, many companies. And we do work with our founders. And it's hopefully good both ways. Like, we're not like helicoptering over our founders. We are legitimately trying to help our founders. It could be through introductions to our network, you know, trying to help provide feedback on decks or blurbs or whatever their growth plans are, whatever is helpful to them. And then the flip side is, you know, hopefully the founders also get to assess us during that time period as well. Like, are these people actually helpful? Do I actually like working with them? But do I actually want them to put more money into my business? Because that actually matters, like, who you take money from. You don't want to take money from assholes. So So it's actually a better way for both parties to kind of work together and get to know each other on a much faster cadence. Like we'll start quickly, but then before taking a much bigger step of investing more money and more time and resources on both ends, you know, kind of test out the waters through that working relationship. And so that's what we are doing.
And I love that. And I heard that similarly from Eric Bond, who is obviously one of your general partners and co-founders of Hustle Fund as well, which is so interesting because you're both deeply relational based. Like that, the relationship that you guys have with your founders, with the investments that you've made, it really, really matters. And what Elizabeth, for those of you guys who are listening out there and watching us on this show, what Elizabeth is essentially talking about is their thesis. It's how they work with new startups. You guys basically agree to date and date quickly. But what's great is Elizabeth is willing to pay the fee, willing to pay the 25 grand fee. And so I really love this idea of executing together. And it actually makes so much sense when you know Elizabeth more. Elizabeth, you did an article with The Nook back in April 15th of 2019. And you said, and this was the title was Advice from a Hustler. I guess that's you, the hustler. Well, I did read it. This is you. You are the hustler. And you said, and I quote, we invest in startups at the early stage when they have basically nothing. So here's the question. Like, Elizabeth, you love working side by side. You love having partnerships with these basically nothing startups. What excites you about having nothing? And what excites you about starting from, what excites you about that grind, that hustle?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I can very much just relate to it, number one, right? I've been in those shoes before. I had a startup, and I remember my very first investors very well, and will always be incredibly grateful for their coming in so early when we pretty much had nothing. Very few people are willing to take a risk on you when you have nothing. And so that is a pretty critical time in a startup. And so I think just from, I don't know if you would call it an emotional perspective, but we understand that emotion. So that's one thing. I mean, I think the self-serving perspective on that is, there's real rapport built at that stage almost as a result of that, right? Like I am most grateful to my investors who came in super early, and that is a strong relationship. And that's the kind of relationship we want with our founders. We don't want to be coming in when everybody's jumping on the bandwagon. Like that, we're a commodity as an investor at that point, right? Like at that point, we're just the money bags. And as a small fund, we cannot be the money bags. We will never be able to, throw more money at a company than, say, Andreessen Horowitz. So I think, every fund has to know where they sit in this stack or whatever you want to call it. And so as a result, like we get the most benefit by going in very early. And then I think secondly is around, I think for whatever reason, investors believe that if there's a lot of traction, like they see a lot of traction, then they have de-risked the business and then they'll invest. From my perspective, actually, in watching all these companies through the 500 Startups Accelerator, that's actually not true. These days, for whatever reason, you can actually get to even $1 million in revenue and not have product market fit. And so that was sort of an interesting observation to me where it's like, well, actually, I see very little difference between companies who have no revenue and companies that have $1 million in revenue, which is like an incredible statement. In other words, in my mind, nothing has been de-risked in that whole period of time, which is crazy. And we can dig into why I believe that. But, from that perspective, then I would much rather go in super early, potentially get a lower valuation, and potentially have some input and feedback on the business so that way founders can kind of get started off on a more efficient front or whatever and build rapport at the best time possible. So that's why I like to go in super early.
It's interesting you say that. And this is a conversation that I had with a venture capitalist probably a couple weeks ago. And there's a lot of nuance to it, but I think I'm going to try my best to describe what I discussed with him around how you can have, just like you said, you can have a company who's been around for a while, who has $1 million in annual recurring revenue and still doesn't have product market fit and is still not de-risked and is still not worth investing in, and investing in. And I was arguing with this individual saying, yes, all these things can be true. And he looked at me, he said, no, an investment bank would look at that and say, man, look at the trajectory, look at the numbers. I said, here's what you're missing. And let me see if this helps as one example in this context. The rise of the rise of personalities. The rise of personalities. The personalities can command $1 million a year in ad revenue, fees, all sorts of traffic-based money generation techniques, but they can have zero product fit in that environment. So with the rise of personality-based products, which is what I was arguing to them, we can see that it takes a lot longer, and I think I'm falling in line with you now. It takes a lot longer to really vet these startups and do the right diligence. And I told them the best way is you have to get in with them. You have to sit with them. You have to see what they're actually doing to really see whether they're a team worth investing in. Would you agree? Is that a worthwhile example? The rise of personality, the cult of personality can change things?
100%. 100%. And I think even making that statement bigger, I think the other way to get to $1 million in revenue, but also very much dependent on an individual, is around pseudo consulting types of things. So, you can have a SaaS business that's got a lot of, let's say, consulting baked in there, get to $1 million in revenue, and maybe have 4 customers or something.
Right.
And that's great. I'm not saying that's a bad business. Certainly it's fantastic for an individual, but for a VC to come in, I have to believe that it can get to much more than that. And the question then is, how does that scale? And so looking just strictly at revenue is not a good way to assess whether it can scale. You have to your point, you have to look under the hood and dig into what is actually happening. Why are people buying? What is actually being sold here? What channels are they using, et cetera? Like all these details that matter rather than the revenue itself.
So I want to ask you this question. We both use the word de-risk, but we know that you love starting with it's the irony is so thick. We've both used this word de-risk, but we know that you love starting and investing in teams that are basically having nothing and starting with nothing, because you and I know what that's like. We know what it's like to hustle and grind our way out of that. And so tell me, explain to the audience, what are you looking to de-risk with your 25 grand and your time on the ground with them? What are you looking to de-risk?
Sure. So before I answer that, I think let's talk first about what needs to be de-risked in a business. So I actually think the first thing that needs to be de-risked is the team. And we can talk about that in a second, but you want to de-risk the team. The second thing you want to de-risk is the problem. And then the last thing down the road, and this is more like Series B or Series C or whatever, you want to de-risk basically ability to scale. So those are kind of the 3 things that you need to, quote, de-risk a business, the basic 3 things. Obviously, there are other things as well, but those are the main things. And the issue that I'm having here with using traction to de-risk the business is I actually don't think that revenue is a good indicator of de-risking actually any of those. But I think a lot of investors feel comfortable for whatever reason in trying to correlate revenue with some of these other things.
That's because they have replaced actual knowledge with dollars and cents on a piece of paper. When you get in with teams, I'm sorry for cutting you off, but I'm passionate about this. Like when you get in and sit with teams and work with the founders and see how they work, that's worth 10x, 100x what some guy who's, a million miles away on looking at a paper and saying they've just crossed 25,000, monthly recurring revenue. That's within the projection that we expected. Good. It's like, so what? That's fakeable, right? Getting on the ground is what counts.
Oh yeah, it's fakeable. So actually, you also touched upon something very briefly that I want to talk about. So let's talk about de-risking team. I think first and foremost, trust is really important. And having backed a lot of companies, there's a small proportion of them that actually were untrustworthy, where they literally ran away with the investors' money. Like no joke, like stole the money. It is actually illegal to do so. Crazy. But as an investor, you are not going to sue them. The money is gone. They're not worth suing. You just take your losses. But nobody talks about it. Like, I'm not going to TechCrunch and saying these people are unscrupulous or whatever. But this is actually something that happens quite a bit in the industry. And you can imagine, actually, it does. There's a certain percentage of bad actors, and if they can get money, they will run with it.
I'm in the crypto game. I know.
And so trust is the first thing, right? Like, even if somebody is super smart and great at executing or whatever, if you don't trust them because for whatever reason, like, that's a problem. And
Absolutely.
so that's something that you need to assess. You cannot assess that with revenue, right? You just can't. And of course, like, even when we spend time with our founders, obviously we will still not know for certainty whether we trust them 5 years, 10 years down the road, but we can at least get more of a sense. And to a certain extent, this is actually one reason why you see investors constantly investing in people in their network. There are certainly a lot of complaints about it, and I don't agree that that is the sole way to invest, but I understand it, at least at a minimum level. You trust that this person will not run away with your money.
That helps.
And so that's the first thing around team. And then the other things around team are around, well, can they execute quickly? Can they learn new skills? Can they recruit? Can they, all these things. All these things are subjective. And certainly when we try to get an assessment of our teams, it's also subjective. But again, for many of these things, you cannot see in the revenue, right? Like, I don't know if you, Peter, can learn new skills by seeing that you grew a company to 25K MRR or 30K MRR. Like, there's no number that makes me think, oh, Peter is really fast at executing, Peter can learn new skills, Peter can recruit well, like all these things.
Right.
And so that is,
you've really been able to, and I think you have it's such a blessing that you've been able to run through so many startups and had so many of these experiences with so many different startups and different companies and hustlers out there that you've been able to kind of see the patterns. It's not, but you can, I think there's a gut level there. And I don't like it when people don't want to say that. There is a real nuance. There is a real aesthetic. There's a real ability to decide based on gut. It's like, I've been here before. I've had these experiences before. It's deja vu. But I want to talk about something that you haven't talked about, but you care a lot about. And I know because on August 30th, someone tweeted at you and they said, "What is the best startup advice you've ever heard?" And your response on August 30th, 2019 is, "Don't lose team morale." I was imminently curious. So my question is this: can you give me an example in your own experience of why team morale mattered and how it helps you and how keeping it together helped you guys get through it?
Oh, for sure. I mean, this is something that I've experienced also firsthand with my own startup. As you know, startups are challenging, right? And so in the beginning, everybody's
going to be the death of me, Elizabeth. They're going to be the death of me.
So everybody's super excited in the beginning, right? Team morale is high. We're going to work on something we really love. We're excited. It's going to work. And then you're in sort of that valley of despair. Things aren't quite working. You're trying to figure things out. Maybe you're doing little pivots, not even big pivots, but little pivots to try to figure out how to make this work. And that's when team morale usually starts to crumble because people start to disagree, like co-founders disagree on the direction or the ideas, or sometimes you have to throw a lot of work out the window, like if your engineering team, and even if it's not a big team, like just the CTO, like your co-founder, wrote all this code towards one direction and then it's the wrong direction. And then you completely have to throw the whole thing out and go a different direction. Like, that just doesn't feel good. And so at this point, you've got a lot of people on your team, or maybe you don't even have a big team. Maybe it's just you and your co-founder. You have a lot of bickering around, disagreement around directions, and you're making so many decisions together every day, day in and day out. Even if you don't disagree most of the time, and you actually agree most of the time, the small percentage where you do disagree starts to amplify because of all the decisions you have to make.
Right.
And so it starts to feel like there's a lot of tension there, and nobody knows what the correct or right answer is. And so it starts to amplify. And when things are not going well, it just gets worse and worse.
Right.
And there's a lot of pressure mounting.
How do you alleviate the tension, Elizabeth? How have you found in your experience to come back to stage one, to come back to home base? What have you done and what have you figured out to bring us home?
Yeah. So I think what I didn't realize when I first started a company was that team morale was so important. And so I didn't realize that as the CEO and you are kind of making these decisions, and then everybody else who is coming along for the ride with you, they feel this huge whiplash. It's kind of like a, I don't know what the right analogy is, but they don't feel the turns as tight as you do. Like, they are swinging tremendously, and their morale is as well. And so I think it's really, really important for the CEO in particular to communicate super well and super clearly and be very transparent, but obviously positive. Now, this is a fine balance. So, for example, if you're trying different experiments, I would very much message it as such. Like, we are trying to achieve X, and we are doing experiments A, B, and C to try to achieve X. We don't know if and any of all of them will work, or any of them will work, but we are going to, all get behind A, B, and C and test and measure. If they don't work, we may end up having to try experiments D, E, and F and throw out the window A, B, and C. But just really clearly setting expectations. But we feel very good and confident that actually we will find something that works, because this is a solvable problem. So, like, making sure there's a positive spin as well. Right. So that way people are not discouraged. So it's a fine balance, but that is exactly what the CEO needs to do. And I think that's very hard, especially for first-time founders. Certainly was hard for me.
Oh yeah. So I know that you coach how do you coach first-time founders to, it's going to sound wacky, but it's what I wrote down here. How do you help first-time founders become more transparent? Because you're cutting through their personality, you're cutting through their character, their natural instincts, and their behavior patterns that have been sedentary and settled in for 30 years. So how do you as a coach, right? How do you as a coach help first-time founders become more transparent? Like, this is a real question. Help me, Elizabeth. How do you do that?
Well, I talk about this thing quite a bit with actually so many of my founders, because what ends up happening is many of my founders will call me up and say, well, I'm having this disagreement with my co-founder about X. And then, I say, okay, I'll listen, like, tell me about X and what's going on. So somebody describes the whole scenario, et cetera. And then usually, pieces of this start to fall out, where I get the sense, well, the co-founder is upset because he or she doesn't feel appreciated or whatever. I mean, I'm just reading in between the lines, and then usually I pull out a story from my own experience of what happened at my own startup that was somewhat related, because everybody tends to have the same problems, and then, help coach the founder around, sort of messaging to try to help with the situation. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't. Actually, for some of our startups, actually, it's not a good fit. The co-founders shouldn't be working together, and that's okay. But I think, this is a very, like, co-founder communication is something that I have seen pretty much every portfolio company and even non-portfolio companies, like my friends' companies, like, face. It is a real problem. I would say that most of my friends who have started companies have dealt with this. I have dealt with this. So it's just actually something that comes up commonly that most first-time founders do not anticipate.
That's a real good one. I mean, I think as a coach, as you are, as well as obviously VC and all that, I think it's so important to help new entrepreneurs learn how to speak their truth, speak their mind, speak what's on their heart. Because so many entrepreneurs, and I'll just speak for myself, I build from the heart, and the heart isn't easy to communicate. You have a feeling, you have a gut, you have something you need to build. There's a passion welling up, and finally it's taking you X number of years to finally pull the trigger and do it. And so it's hard to be able to communicate all that messaging, all that story. But what I think that what I know that you and Eric and Xian are great at, because I've known you guys, and you guys are awesome, and I've been able to dig into your past and see how you guys work, is you guys are really great at helping first-time founders create their story. And I want to dig into that a little bit. And I don't know if that's something that you explicitly do as part of your strategy and thesis, but that's something that I have experienced having, and full disclosure, guys, Elizabeth has invested in my company. And so I probably should have said that at the beginning. But I've been able to see that firsthand through my brother and through the leadership guidance that you and Eric have given him. So how have you guys created a company culture, and why is storytelling and why is helping first-time founders learn to tell their story so important to you?
Yeah, I think this ties back to what makes founders successful in fundraising. I think that you know, when we talked earlier about pattern matching, but I think part of that is the people who are successful not only fit that pattern, but also are very good at storytelling. And it could be inherent or natural for them, but it could also be that they are part of inner circles and understand how to craft that story.
Understand the language, the verbiage.
Yep. And so it's very interesting, like many years ago, I'll give you a concrete example. Many years ago, while I was at 500 Startups, I backed effectively a media company, if you will. Now, VCs in general, like, they hate media companies. If you just send them an email saying we're a media company, they're going to delete the email right away. They won't even dig into it. You will not even get a meeting. So for this woman, she was kind of facing similar feedback. We ended up helping her, like, change her story. It's still obviously the same business, but the story was around data then. Like, her new story was around data, because when you think about it, like, as a media company, you have a lot of subscribers, a lot of readers, you know, very engaged people. You're able to collect a lot of data on them. And so her entire pitch then turned into a data pitch. Obviously, it was the same business, but it was just much more exciting to VCs. And so she's getting meetings. And then once you get meetings, then people, you know, will invest for a whole variety of reasons. Like, obviously your business is a big one, but also how compelled they are by you as a founder as well. She's a very compelling founder. And so all of a sudden, you know, everyone was very interested in investing. So that's like a concrete example of how just changing the story can help you, because the first step is you have to be able to get your foot in the door.
I love it.
VCs end up triaging a lot of things. So if your initial story or blurb isn't even good enough to get the meeting, like, you're out of luck. And so that's something that is really important. So even if our founders don't fit a certain demographic or whatever, by helping them with their story, they can at least get their foot in the door, and then they themselves, you know, once they're there, hopefully can sell their business, basically.
And I love the fact that, and if you go to hustlefund.vc, you search on the website, you go through the slides, you'll see that you guys I don't think part of your strategy, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe I'm right here, is that part of your strategy is not focused on diversity. However, everything that you do, all the decisions you make, go through the lens of being situationally aware that diversity matters and it's very important. Is that fair? Because a lot of the stuff that you're talking about with helping first-time founders, especially founders from diverse backgrounds, let's be honest, sometimes being an immigrant coming to America and having a great idea is, you have a recipe for disaster, because you have none of the vernacular, you have none of the nuance, you have none of the aesthetics. So they don't have all of this. And so I'm, you know, to everyone out there, what you and Xian and Eric do is you help these first-time founders who are often coming from diverse backgrounds create a narrative that isn't fake. It's not just placating to the listeners and to the VC, the cookie cutter VCs, but it's being able to help them tell their real story authentically in a way that matters and has impact. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. I think that is a very fine line that we tread. Like, we're not a diversity fund, but diversity is important to us, and diversity goes beyond gender and race. You know, I think so many of our founders do not fit the mold of a stereotypical, you know, pattern match for founder, whether it is on gender or race, but also personality, where people worked or didn't work, or where they went to school or didn't go to school, et cetera. So on many dimensions, geography as well.
Awesome. Well, I have one final question for you here, Elizabeth. On July 31st, 2009, you said, I just got my new business cards for the Beakster. What the hell is the Beakster? And what happened to that?
Yeah. So after I left my cushy job at Google in late 2008, I left because I really felt like the company was too big and not for me. Certainly everyone there is smart, but I wanted to be able to start my own company. But I had no idea what I was doing. And one of those things that I worked on, one of my side projects that went on for way too long, was this company called ParrotView. Okay. And so I'm amazed that you even found that tweet, but that, I assume, is what it's in reference to. ParrotView ended up failing for so many reasons, but the main one being that nobody wanted it. And that's why I actually firmly believe that that's really important to validate quite quickly, because as you can tell, even from that date, and I told you I left in 2008, I think that even by mid-2009, we didn't even have quite a great product out the door yet, which is really slow to validate.
Well, not maybe, but I'd love to have you on our season 2 of VC hunting, and maybe you can give us some more story about the Beakster and that epic failure, which I'm sure turned into some great lessons. Elizabeth Yin from Hustle Fund, guys. You can find more information about Elizabeth on vchunting.com, Elizabeth-Yin. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Peter.
There's just something that I really enjoy about what I'm doing. And well, you know what I'm doing? I am interviewing wonderful, beautiful people who have great experiences in the venture capital world, who have great stories to tell, and we can extract a lot of lessons from these individuals. I really hope that you guys enjoyed this conversation that I had with Elizabeth, and I can't wait to have another conversation with her. I wanted to dig a little bit more deeply into her experience as a woman in venture capital, because it's something that I've been around. Obviously, I'm not a woman, so I don't know the inner details and the nuances to that. But I think there's real opportunities, and I'm just going to speak from the heart here, because I have a daughter, eldest daughter, and it's important to me that opportunities are given to her like everyone else. That's all I will say. That she should have access to the same opportunities everywhere and be treated fairly everywhere. And so that's something that's really important to me as a father. But what I loved about Elizabeth is that she really exuded what I already knew to be true from Hustle Fund and Eric, and knowing Eric and Xian, her other general partners and co-founders, is that they really are relationship based. They really want to help grow individuals and teams. And I love this idea that team morale, like this, her answer to the question, what's the best startup advice, is don't lose team morale, because she invests in teams. Great venture capitalists invest in the people, right? It's flesh and blood at the end of the day, right? We can talk about all the numbers, all the fun stuff, but it's flesh and blood at the end of the day. It's real people at the other end of that line. And these real people, and I'm one of those people. I'm an entrepreneur. Those people are flesh and blood, and they have dreams they want to achieve. They have dreams that they want to achieve. Just like Elizabeth had dreams that she wanted to achieve, she still has dreams that she wants to achieve. She achieved some of them. I have dreams I've achieved. I have even more dreams that I'd like to achieve. And when it comes to the VC game, helping those first-time founders, those dreams that they want to achieve, and have the right narratives, be coached in the right way, make sure that they have access to the right opportunities, right? The right professional courtesies, as Elizabeth was talking about, and being taken care of as a first-time startup entrepreneur, right? Not just being seen as a number, but having people like Elizabeth and Eric and Xian work with them, walk with them, really understand their hustle, their grind, really understand who they are. I think Elizabeth and Eric and Xian have the right recipe for a microfund, the right recipe for a venture capital fund, the right recipe for a living. Investing in people. One thing I didn't ask Elizabeth about is those hippos. What's up with the hippos? Maybe on our next one I'll ask her about the hippos, guys. Well, I hope you guys really enjoyed this episode. We got some great guests coming up next. And if you want to find more information about Elizabeth Yin and Hustle Fund, feel free to go over to vchunting.com/Elizabeth-Yin. I'll see you guys next time.